If your child can read and if your child can do math, the world is their oyster. Like, don't put so much pressure on yourself to feel like everything is weighing on you to cover every subject. Because if you teach your child to be a critical thinker, if you teach them to read, to have a love of learning, and also to be able to do math, then really they can do anything. I felt like at times I sensed almost a false dichotomy between either we have to present rigorous academics or interest-led learning.
Yes.
And I think the cool thing about homeschooling is there's the gift of time. And so your child can have time to pursue both.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive in your homeschooling journey. I know from personal experience that this journey can be filled with great joy and wonder, fraught with angst and doubt, and include constant questions like, am I enough? Am I ruining my kids? Will they be able to get into college? And will they be equipped to have a successful life after homeschooling? This podcast is aimed at answering your questions, inspiring you in your journey, and equipping you to set your children up for success. The Zan Tyler podcast is made possible by our incredible sponsor, BJU Press Homeschool, the publisher of curriculum and resources that you can trust, resources that will support your children's faith and will deepen their understanding of biblical truth. We all want our children to enjoy a robust education that leads to a rich life of loving God, of using their gifts to glorify God and serve their neighbors. And to this end, I am happy to welcome Rachel Novak to our podcast. She is the mother of 6 homeschool children and the author of the new book, Their Future is Shining Bright. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us, first I want to know about the title, Their Future is Shining Bright, because I remember reading in your book that it might have World War II origins.
Yeah, actually, you're right. So it was an expression of optimism in a time when the world looked dark. And that spoke to me. I've seen it in some of Wendell Berry's works as a chapter title. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, years ago. And it came to me as we were putting the book together. I think a passage I've been meditating on is how love always hopes. And as I did a little bit of a study on that, I read that that's not only about a future hope, of course, though we do have a future hope, but it's a practical application in our relationship with those we love, and that we can always believe the best. There's a part of us that can always hold on to hope in any situation, that no situation is beyond the goodness of God, the grace of God, that we can always hold on to hope. And I think in a time when the world can feel overwhelming and scary and dark, that it's important to hold on to that hope that ultimately comes from God.
You know, I think in your very first chapter, it might have been the introduction, you used the quote of hope from Emily Dickinson.
Yes.
Which is one of my favorite quotes. And I could just tell reading through, if nothing else, when people read your book, read all the quotes in the chapter titles, because you get a little bit of a literary education and a reminder on the way. And I really love that about your book.
Thank you.
No, just so thoughtful. So when I first heard the word homeschool in 1984, it changed the entire trajectory of my life, and everything was new. There was no help, no support, no visual. We didn't know anybody in the world who homeschooled, so no visual of what this should look like. But I love your story of how you were introduced to homeschooling at really a pretty early age by aunts and cousins.
Yes, and I'm so grateful for you, first-generation homeschoolers who I say we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, everything is so much easier for us. It's incredible to see the exponential growth in homeschooling. It's growing 7 times faster than private school enrollment. Here in Texas, I just read in the Houston Chronicle that we have twice as many homeschool students as students in private schools, which
That is really an amazing statistic. I know that there are more homeschoolers than private schoolers in North Carolina, and there was another state that just came out with that statistic. We're getting a little close in South Carolina. In just the last 5 years, I think we've gone from 17,000 homeschoolers to 39,000 homeschoolers, and I think that's kind of a lowball number. But we're a small state, and those are you're a huge state with Tim Lambert and the Texas Homeschool Coalition, and that. But those are amazing statistics. There's an end to the growth of private schools because most of them are brick and mortar. I mean, there's some virtual schools, but with homeschooling, the growth can continue and continue and continue.
Yeah. And so it's so amazing. We have so many resources now available to us. And I remember my aunts and cousins at times wondering if it was okay to go out during the day because someone might accuse your children of truancy. And so now to think about how normal it feels, it's really exciting.
So tell me a little bit about your childhood and how you learned homeschooling from them or observed it in them for the first time.
Yeah, it was something that I was very familiar with, although I didn't think it would be something that I would pursue, which is interesting. My husband was also homeschooled. His parents were linguists, Bible translators in West Africa, and he grew up in the jungle. And so they were homeschooled until he was 13. And then he went, and he's 57. And so, I mean, that was quite unusual.
Yes,
in that time.
very. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Then he went on to boarding school a couple countries away from his parents. So he hadn't lived at home since he was 13 years old. So my husband and I were both familiar with homeschooling, but we didn't necessarily think it would be for us. And so then, the Lord led us in that direction. Man has a plan, but the Lord establishes their path.
Amen. Amen to that. So Rachel, you go into some detail in your book and in some podcasts I've heard you on, talking about the impact that your aunt and cousins had on you in terms of homeschooling and what you saw happen in their home. And one of the reasons I want you to tell us about that is because sometimes what we're doing that seems very daily and very mundane can impact people in a way that we'll never know this side of heaven. So tell me how your aunt and your cousins impacted you. How did that homeschool story live in your heart that long?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful point that really what we're doing can extend so much more beyond. And even just the ordinariness in our work, the way that it can impact people, I mean, I think that's very powerful. So, my mom has 6 sisters, and let's see, 3 of them homeschooled, and 2 lived on the same street as me.
Oh, that's amazing.
So I got a very close look at what it was like to see a homeschooling family. One of my aunts has 5 children and the other one had 2, and they were raised together. And so I would come over and see what they were reading, and I could see that homeschooling is a lifestyle. It isn't so much school at home, but there was the flexibility of really making it a life. We would sit around the piano and sing hymns together. And that is something that has really lived on inside of me and been a huge part of my family culture. My kids, my eldest 4 kids all play instruments. Singing is a huge part of our family life. When they come home from college, we're still singing together. That is 100% from their influence. I also think some of the best advice that they gave me that I have carried forward and that I think was brilliant, is that they said, if your child can read and if your child can do math, the world is their oyster. Like, don't put so much pressure on yourself to feel like everything is weighing on you to cover every subject. Because if you teach your child to be a critical thinker, if you teach them to read, to have a love of learning, and also to be able to do math, then really they can do anything.
I really love that story. And I think you learned how to sew from your aunt.
Yes. They were on a tight budget. And so they were thinking creatively. My aunt would say, hey, can you babysit for me so I can run some errands? Because they were on a 1-income family. They made a lot of sacrifices to be able to homeschool. They did not. One of my aunts in particular, they were on a very tight budget and they had to really stretch things to make it work out. But she would say, if you babysit, I will teach you how to sew. And sewing became one of the greatest delights of my life. I spent years making most of my kids' clothes. It brought me so much joy. It just made me come alive. And that was because of her being in a sort of dire situation financially, trying to find how can I get in a date night with my husband, thinking creatively, and just the way that God can use those lessons to bring out so much good.
Yeah, I really think that is an amazing part of your story. And I just think the Lord just put those seeds in you that really seem to germinate all of your life and maybe gave you a deeper understanding of homeschooling than you knew at the time and helped with the courage to make that decision. And as I read your book and understand your lifestyle more, I just, it was really powerful to me to see all that. I really appreciated that.
Well, I'm so grateful for all of you who have gone before me. What a blessing.
I love the story about your child in second grade, the lunchroom and the pressure. Will you tell that story to us?
Yeah. So I had always been interested in education. I was coming from Madison, Wisconsin. I had studied education, and we had a beautiful preschool experience with our kids, learning through play, time in nature. It's interesting. I think parents can sometimes worry about the preschool years. I feel like those aren't as like the stakes aren't as high then, right? Like they can go to a little preschool and if you need a break to run errands or whatever, it became too complicated as our family grew, but I don't have any regrets about sending them to that little learning through play school. It was very much aligned with our values and a beautiful experience. But then when it came time to transition into grade school, it was different. The schools at the time here, and for the record, I am not anti-school. I believe there are many beautiful schools, and we have some beautiful classical schools here. And so I don't want to create some kind of, like false dichotomy, or make generalizations about schools. But at the time, my neighbor was filling up an entire trash bin of worksheets alone from her daughter's kindergarten class. That was the situation in our public school. And in the Christian school where we sent my son, they were continually losing recess because a child would be talking. He would be in school all day and then come home and literally have a stack of homework to do. And it was especially bleak in second grade. The first grade teacher was a little less intense, but the second grade teacher they were always losing recess. I would pick him up and he would look like he had been working on Wall Street. He would slump into his chair and just say, "Another day losing recess, Mom." I went to see him on his birthday and they had a red light on. And I thought, what's going on?
All right, wait a minute. Where did they have the red light on?
Okay, I'm sorry. I missed that part of the story. In the lunchroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
I call it the curse of the silent lunchroom. I mean, I addressed that in some of my workshops. But anyway, go ahead. So we're kindred spirits on this.
Oh, I'm so glad. And so I go to sit by my son and they're like, "Oh, you can't talk to him," which was the whole point of me coming to have lunch with him because the red light is on and there's no talking. And this is how we must manage a large group of children, which I write about how in the first chapter, the origins of the school system and how it's not necessarily based upon what is best for children, the best way for them to learn, what's developmentally appropriate, but what was efficient and the goals of an industrialized civilization.
I want to get back to the story, but this reminded me of something you said in the book, and I love it because of the wording. And you were talking about what it means to live in an industrialized education in an industrialized society. And it starts off with the chief end of education. And it was basically just to create a controlled group of kids who could work hard and not ask a lot of questions.
To make good citizens.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a noble goal, but not alone, but what really hit me there, Rachel, is the chief end of education is. And as Christians, we start off with what is the chief end of man, to glorify God and love him forever, And so I just thought, boy, that dichotomy was so clear in the way you were describing maybe the lifelessness of education sometimes in an institutional setting, or at least lifelessness in the goals. Whereas we feel like we have such a rich and robust life with our kids. in our home setting.
Exactly. And it's not that it was all like students did receive an education where they hadn't received an education. And so I don't mean to cast it all in a negative light, but it's also like, if it's not working for you, then let's explore what might better serve your family or where the Lord is leading your specific child and your specific family.
Okay, let's get back to the red light for just a minute.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you could not talk to your children, your son, during lunchtime. Was that pretty typical? Was that every day? Was the red light always on?
Oh, yes, because they said otherwise the students wouldn't eat. They would have too much time talking and they needed to finish their lunch and they needed to stay focused. And so in order to essentially like have control of the mob.
That is amazing. So all right. So tell me then what led that to you how did that lead you to bringing your son home?
Okay. So then the next big point was that we were working through a stack of worksheets, as was typical in the evening. I had four children, 7 and under. And really, like, the amount of homework he had was equivalent to what you do in an entire day of homeschooling at that point. I mean, there was reading lessons and math lessons and timed math, which I talk about later. The timed math can really create anxiety in children. Some of the best mathematicians are the slowest mathematicians. Math can be a slow process. It doesn't require speed. And so starting at a young age to force time pressure with math can really be something that creates anxiety in students. Anyway, my son was one of those students, and he looked up at me, his blue eyes filled with tears, and he said, "Mom, this is just all too much pressure." And he was in 2nd grade.
I can't believe he could verbalize that like that. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and he's someone who can tolerate a lot of pressure. He's applying to med school. He's always been someone who has an incredible amount of grit, but even for himself, it was just too much. And I knew we needed to make a change. But still, I was very afraid to start homeschooling. And it was really something that the Lord gently led me into through a series of events where things didn't work out as we thought. And then ultimately I decided to give it a try, but I decided I would try it in the summer so that if it didn't work out, we could send our kids back to school in the fall.
That was brilliant. Yes. Is this when you decided to pull him out?
Actually, no, we did finish that year. But in the meantime, my husband had several potential job opportunities that actually both ended up falling through. But one would have required us to homeschool temporarily, which was sort of the gateway for me into this lifestyle. I started thinking, at first I was like, how could I do this? How could I'm not equipped. I felt really intimidated even by things like teaching my child to read. At that season, which I would say, like, don't be. It can be hard. I have one child with dyslexia, but for the most part, it's doable. Even if your child has dyslexia, it's doable. But yeah, I felt like I wasn't qualified. I felt like I needed to have someone who was like professionally trained as a teacher to come in to teach my children. But various things happened and those things fell through. It was again an example of God's guiding hand through situations that seemed disappointing and really even devastating. A job fell through at the last minute that we were counting on. We were literally thinking we would be moving in 2 weeks, and then it fell through. And then, so ultimately, though, that gave me the courage slowly to feel like I could do it.
Well, that's a powerful story. Now, this time, so you started when he was in the 3rd grade?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you had how many other children at that point?
At that point, I probably had 4 and was pregnant with my 5th. Yes.
So it wasn't like you were just bringing him home and that was all you had to deal with. And you also had an adopted child from Ethiopia.
Exactly. Yes.
And so, you had a lot of change and transition in your household going on.
We did. She had severe malnutrition when we adopted her, and she had a lot of different therapies that we were having folks come into the house to do many different kinds of therapies. And so it definitely wasn't like everything was going smoothly. But honestly, even if you're in that situation, I think all of the running around to school, the obligations, the pickup times, the extracurriculars. I mean, all the kids were doing sports by the second grade. So all the parents were, not all of the parents, this is a generalization, but many of the parents were spending their weekends at soccer games or baseball tournaments, which that's fine if that's your thing, but it really wasn't our thing. We wanted time at home. It was so disruptive having babies, and we had therapies at home and things like that, that honestly, bringing everyone home really simplified our life. I think it feels like it could be making your life more complicated, but for us, it made it simpler.
I think that's a powerful statement. So I know your book is mainly homeschooling in high school. So I want to transition and talk about that a little bit. And I feel like I'm losing so much of your life experience by making this jump, but our time is limited. And I want to read again one of the quotes. This is, and I also love your chapter titles. So I'm going to read a chapter title, A Vision for Adolescence, Belonging, and Secondary Education. And then you have a quote by J.R.R. Tolkien that says, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And so basically, tell me what you love about homeschooling in high school, why you think those can be the best years and their future can still be shining bright.
That's such a great question. And thank you so much for asking. Well, first of all, I was a doula. I was a lactation counselor. I loved the baby years. I really could have gone on forever. My husband's older than me. We had our last baby when he was 50, and he's like, I think I'm getting too old. And I'm like, you're young for Abraham, like compared to Abraham. I mean, I didn't think there would be years I could love more, but I will say I love the teenage years. I love them just as much as I loved the baby years, which came as quite the surprise to me. And I think a lot of people paint them in a very negative light. And some families do face hard things. I think any season can be hard, and any season can call us. My babies were not good sleepers. And I felt like I was just crying out to the Lord, trying to understand like how I could manage my big family at the time while still also loving it. So I think any season can, ask us to really rely upon the Lord in new and deeper ways. But for myself, I found the teenage years to be so wonderful. And I think that really having them at home was something that made them the most wonderful, because I think that and I write about this in chapter 1, in a school environment, there can be a lot of pressure to conform. Never in human history have children been so primarily influenced by their peers. And of course, we want our children to have friendships. That's important. We want them to have peer relationships, but those have always coexisted alongside relationships with, mentors or people who are younger too, not just folks who are older. And I think that's something I witnessed seeing my cousins as first generation homeschoolers. They could mingle with adults, but also with younger kids. You weren't segregated based upon age. And so I write about in the book how when kids are in this situation, there's a longing in the heart of the adolescent student to learn culture. This is a time when we're passing along culture. And so we can see this clearly, that what teenagers do when in the absence of mentors and like elders, you could say, speaking into their lives, they create their own culture, and it's defined by their own clothing, their own lingo. Lingo.
Yeah, that's right. You're right.
Their own music. And then the parent is on the outside of that culture. And so that can create a lot of contention between parents and children. And so I think when we had them at home, they had that influence. It's not like they couldn't relate to their peers. They relate well to their peers in college. They're both at Texas A&M, my adult kids now. They don't struggle to relate, but also they didn't only relate to their peers. And I think that there's such a strong pressure to conform in the teenage years. And actually, I learned in the research for my book, that the brain chemistry of a teen is different and makes them more susceptible to strong feelings of rejection. Things said about them in that time can linger. I think if we look at our own high school years, I don't know, maybe you made it through high school unscathed. Myself, I did not. I made choices and decisions that I regret. I learned about friendship or dating and romance, things that really actually wounded me, if I'm being honest, that didn't set me up for health in the future. decisions that I didn't necessarily want to make, but that I'm not, not taking responsibility, but do you know what I'm saying?
But what you say about rejection is particularly true. I think that high school students really do fear that. And when they're set apart in that environment where they don't have a lot of relationships around them, it can be, particularly bad or harmful. And I love the way that you set that up in the book. I'm not using Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, as a role model here, but in the 90s, he made the statement that American high school education is obsolete and that we need to replace the 3 R's with relationship, rigor, and relevance.
Wow.
Which, that's pretty, and that's a pretty good definition of what I think makes homeschooling in high school so powerful, and it works, is because you've got people in relationship who are really concerned about their future, and you've got the rigor as much as you choose to have, and then you have the relevance that what they're doing is actually going to be relevant in life when they leave school. And so I really appreciate the research you've done. For those of you, nobody's seen the book yet because it will be coming out shortly. But there's a lot of research in Rachel's books where she pulls from studies today on education, the history of education, the science of the brain, all types of things. And I think it'll just be really encouraging to you as a homeschooling mom.
Did you see the study in chapter 1 about conformity in the lines? So there was a study that they had students look at a picture where there was a set of lines, and in length there was one that was much shorter, one that was much longer, and one that matched exactly. And it was alarming to see. So they put these students in with a group of actors where they would say, "Oh no, the correct line." Essentially, gaslighting is the term that we would use.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
And they would gaslight these kids and say, I think they were college students, "Oh, the longer line matches." And the percentage that conformed, it was just outstanding, like, alarming. It was alarming to see. I think it was 76% of the kids conformed to what the peers said, at least one time. I mean, and that was back in the 50s, I think, when that study was done.
Yeah.
And the studies have only gotten to show
worse. Yes. And now we have cyberbullying, and a whole new culture that leads to more depression and that feeling of isolation now more than ever. And I think you just do a great job of taking us all down that research trail. And so, all right, I have another quote. Again, it's the chapter of your title, the title of your chapter followed by a quote. This is chapter 3, The Best of Both Worlds. The powerful synthesis of core academics and interest-led learning. I love that concept. We'll talk about it in a minute. But I love the C.S. Lewis quote you use. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And there's just a lot of power in that. So talk to us a minute about what this means, the synthesis of core academics and interest-led learning.
Yeah, well, as I see it, you've been in the homeschooling world a lot longer than me, but I felt like at times I sensed almost a false dichotomy between either we have to present rigorous academics or interest-led learning.
Yes.
And I think the cool thing about homeschooling is there's the gift of time. And so your child can have time to pursue both.
Yes.
We don't have to compromise on either.
That's exactly right. And it's really not an either or.
It is not an either or.
And I like the fact that you're bringing it to the forefront.
Yeah. And I think leaning too far into one side, could potentially be problematic. I think our kids need time. I think they need an excellent education, but they also need time to explore their interests. And C.S. Lewis saw this, Dorothy Sayers saw this. So I think that, let's see, I know I have some quotes right here from that chapter in my notes. C.S. Lewis said, "Any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun, which you could never get from reading a reading books on astronomy, these pure and spontaneous pleasures are patches of godlight in the woods of our experience. And Dorothy Sayers says it's the business of education to wait upon Pentecost.
I cannot believe you because I can't believe this, but those are the two other quotes I had picked out for us to talk about in my notes. And so let's take C.S. Lewis's first about the patch of godlight, and it because of the way you've set up the juxtaposition. There's nothing wrong with doing a study of astronomy.
Exactly.
But when you see that patch of sunlight, or as my husband used to do, you take the telescope out at night and you look at the stars and the constellations. Well, that is a powerful mix of both things.
Exactly. And I think that we don't want to abandon the textbook learning that's important for our kids. I believe to have, a solid education, to understand history, to be able to do math well. I think those things are really important. But also to have the wonder. I like what Chesterton said. He said that modern thought has a way of dulling the ancient instinct of astonishment. And so we can have both. And I'm saddened that sometimes the two are pitted against each other, because I don't think it has to be like that.
I think you're exactly right. There are a couple examples. This is not a podcast about me, but you've triggered a lot of thought in me. Like, one of the things we did, we were using the BJU Press curriculum. There weren't a lot of people who sold to homeschoolers back in the day. And BJU Press was always a support for me. And we did their literature and their history, American literature and American history, in the same year. And then we went to Boston and walked the Freedom Trail. We went to Philadelphia and saw the Liberty Bell. They had grown up in the legislature with me. So their civics education had been on the spot training, from the time they were 7 years old. It was our home away from home until Ty started high school. And so it was that blend of the academic with the power of life experiences that you express so well in your chapters.
We spent 2 years learning about Europe, and then my husband works for a British company, and so we were able to spend 3 weeks in October in Italy and France. And so it was great. I learned Italian. One of my daughters learned French. We spent so much time learning about the history. People talk about the Dark Ages as if nothing happened.
Right. And so it was all darkness. Yes. Yes.
It's like, wow, do you know what was actually done during that time period? And to make history come alive. When I was in high school, and school in general, I thought history was boring. That's the thing about homeschooling. My aunts, the first generation homeschooler, said it gave them the education of a lifetime. And I've stolen that expression from them because it's true. Didn't you feel that as you were homeschooling?
Absolutely. Because I was the kid who was driven by grades. And that was very important to me. And I got a really good education in high school and college. And so I'm not casting dispersions on that. But the joy and the hands-on was not there. And that could have been as much me. I was involved in a lot of extracurriculars, so there wasn't time for everything. But that added personal experience, hands-on learning, travel. And if you can't travel, there are a lot of other ways you can bring the world to you.
100%. I will say, our trip, everything went wrong. I got food poisoning. My husband got influenza. I had to drive a 12-passenger van into Paris to return it after we had gone through the Alps.
On the road?
Thankfully, no, but it was a manual.
Yes.
That's England.
Okay.
It was a manual, though, and I hadn't driven a stick shift since I was 20 something. But my husband was too sick to drive. I feel like what we learned, it was cool to have that experience, but it's definitely not that you need to have that experience, especially now with all the resources available.
Right.
The beauty of the education was in the learning itself, and that was just the cherry on the top.
Yes. So all right. Okay, I want to talk about one quote before we leave this, and I want to talk about practical things people with high school students can do.
Yeah.
Your quote from Dorothy Sayers, who wrote The Tools of Lost Learning. Is that right? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can't remember if I got that title right. Tell us what that means. It is the business of education to wait upon Pentecost. Kind of unpack that for us.
Yeah, so I go on to say in the book, she lamented that the structure of syllabi and examinations may work against the moments, dulling the rush of cloven fire that ignites the receptive mind. Okay, so that's the first point, that sometimes if we're only having our children memorize facts, think about how Christ himself, he didn't just speak in facts, he could have, but he spoke in story. He related to the people. And so I think he gives us an example in that. But also, she says, we cannot summon this insight. This is a paraphrase, but we can prepare a place for it. I think also sometimes as homeschoolers, we feel like everything is all upon us to make our kids be a certain end product. And that's not true either. That's the Lord's work. We can prepare a place for their learning. We can prepare a place, in their hearts, to love goodness and virtue and all of those things. But that's ultimately the work of the Spirit to bring it to life. And so I think though, when we can give them the spaciousness, when you're in school all day, there's just not the spaciousness. There's not the gift of time to be able to always, kids can explore extracurriculars, which I guess, but that's a little bit different than interest-led learning.
That's right. You can't. One author who was a public school teacher said the reason he loved homeschooling because their children could craft a self far from the madding crowd. I don't know why I remember that quote, but it is true. My kids would say, well, Mom, did you read this book or this book or this book? And I'd say, no, I read the Cliff Notes. Remember, I was in school 8 hours a day. I didn't have time to read. And of course, there were a lot of books I read, and I didn't just, anyway. But it is that idea of time and space are so powerful, Rachel, and you do such a good job of bringing that out. I really appreciate that in your book.
Oh, well, thank you. It's interesting. I think I write about how child labor was the impetus for, to protect children from labor, to create the hours of the school day. But I think particularly in high school, it's amazing if kids can have a schedule that's more like college. Think about it. When kids go to college, they're not in school all day. They go to class, for however many hours a week, depending on the credits that they're taking. And then they have time to study, but also have their own schedule. And I think in high school, when kids can drive, when they're more independent, and also back to what you were saying about the quote about Bill Gates, I think we are in a revolution. Now I'm a little bit shifting gears. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. In terms of even what high school is going to look like, because in the early 2000s, 300,000 kids in the entire U.S. took dual enrollment. In 2021, that number was 1.5 million. I just looked again recently to be most up to date, and it's 2.8 million students. And they're not just preparing for college. They are getting certificates. They're learning trades. And so maybe we are in a revolution right now in terms of what high school is even going to look like.
Right. And I think the burden of debt that the generation before us has borne is, and now the cost of higher education is doubling, tripling, quadrupling, and that's a terrible burden to take into adulthood.
Exactly. And I write about that in the book too. $1.7 trillion in debt, half of which is undergrad debt. And then is, the way that is affecting people in terms of when they feel like they can get married, when they feel like they can start a family, when they are actually objectively able to buy a house,
Yes. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation with Rachel. You can find Rachel at her website, rachelkovac.com, and that's spelled Kovac. And as always, you can find me at zantyler.com. May God continue to bless you and your family in your homeschooling journey. And until next time, bye.